Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I'm making some pixel art Spider-Man sprites because I wanted to go over this idea of building up a sprite from a stick figure. Now this is one of the ways that I go about creating character sprites, and I often get questions about this, just kind of asking for clarity about how to add form to a base stick figure skeleton. The stick figure that I create is a little bit more informative than maybe your classic image of one. Basically what I'm doing is finding the placement of key points of anatomy like the head and the pelvis and the limbs. And if there are any changes in angle there, like elbows and knees, I'll add those in too. But it really depends on the pose. For the first one here, I'm planning out a neutral standing pose because it'll become the baseline for this character. So when we end up moving the figure around into more dynamic poses, we'll always have this as a neutral point of reference for their overall sizing. Even with the standing sprite though, it's important, at least if you're doing kind of a realistic human character, to introduce some slight angling and curvature into the pose for kind of a more natural appearance that isn't just as rigid as using like straight up vertical lines. In this way, the stick figure can be used as this sort of simplified guide for the way that we interpret the human body and the way that those natural angles and curves are incorporated into kind of the visual flow of the character as a whole. Once that basic framework is in a good spot, I move on to actually building up the silhouette. And to do this, we need to consider what sorts of shapes are going to be created by the musculature. So for instance, on the legs, we'll have the thigh adding a lot of bulk at that spot, and also giving it kind of a slightly round silhouette, while the lower leg, when viewed from the side like this, is going to show more rounding toward the back of the leg for the calf, while remaining more flat at the front for the shin. We can also look out for similar tapering in the arm for the bicep and the forearm. But the thing that's tough is that at a lower resolution like this, your options can feel somewhat limited. If you add one too many pixels, you might either lose the curvature that you're going for, or you could also end up with a silhouette that just kind of looks like a skeleton who's smuggling water balloons under a bodysuit. In this phase of the illustration, the approach that I'm taking is to come up with something that just kind of looks approximately correct and retains the flow of that stick figure planning. And we'll be able to add even more clarity and refinement at the color and shading stage of things. For now, let's move on to the other three poses that I made, and then we'll swing back around after to color all of them after getting those silhouettes in place. For the next one, I'm doing one of those classic Spider-Man jump poses with all his limbs up and bent. So to get started, I've copied over that standing sprite, and I'm repositioning the hands and the feet, and then just connecting them back up to the body. You can see I'm leaving that standing sprite off to the side, and again, that's just to have that point of reference to ensure that there's some sort of consistent sizing between these sprites. If this were being made for a game, we wouldn't want the sprite to look like it's shrinking or growing when it's going into different poses, so it always helps to weigh them against each other while creating them in tandem like this. One of the key inflection points in a pose like this are the knees, so I brought those into the stick figure this time around, because it's going to be really important to hit that change in angle right there. When I was just beginning in pixel art, a lot of my sprites would default to having these sort of noodle limbs, I guess, because there wasn't really much thought put into accentuating these changes in angle. It was more just trying to create some kind of smooth arc, because I guess I knew how to do that at least. But that's not really how limbs work, unless maybe you're specifically going for kind of a lo-fi cartoon character look or something. So with this silhouette, we've got that thigh form again, coming around to a tapering for the calf. And we can see a similar tapering with the arm too. In the stick figure form, I tried to imagine where the spine would be, and the full torso, the silhouetted version, was built up to kind of retain that planned curvature within the silhouette too. Especially for something like a superhero character, I feel like it's okay if you need to exaggerate these postures a little bit extra if you need to, even if you kind of have to break the anatomy in a sense to do it. Because if it's going to help communicate that pose a little bit more, it's just going to read really well and can end up looking a little bit extra dynamic too. Up next is one of my favorite Spider-Man poses. It's him swinging with the arm that'll be holding the web extended straight down. And I think there's just kind of a great energy to that sort of pose. And because the base posture is similar to that of the jump, I started by modifying the stick figure from that one. Once again, the leg has a pretty tight bend to it, so the silhouette form will have a lot of overlap of the upper and lower leg, but you'll see that I leave at least a 1 pixel gap so that the heel of the foot is still resolved within that silhouette. The other tricky thing is that the arm going straight down really only seemed to work at widths of 1 or 2 pixels, kind of depending on the exact spot. but I still wanted there to be, kind of that tapering musculature to it. So these kinds of decisions can be tricky at low resolutions like this, just because of how much a single pixel can add to a silhouette. Like if there's a spot on the arm of the leg that's only 2 pixels wide, and we add an extra pixel in there to provide more muscle, we've now increased that bulk by 50%. So you gotta kind of pick and choose those additions carefully. For now, I've left it mostly with a bit of that straight portion of the arm visible, and I think the muscle definition and the tapering idea is gonna be something that's easier to tackle during the coloring phase. The last pose is going to be another swinging one, kind of flying through the air while gripping the web with both hands at the same point. For this one, I was thinking about how to make the arms basically overlapping each other from this angle, but then countering that by having the legs be slightly apart so that at least each of those could be resolved. Really, the goal with this one was a bit different from the rest, because rather than having each limb kind of off in different directions, this was more about creating this overall arcing gesture through the entire body. So when building up the form, I'm still thinking about the distribution of muscle mass that we've been talking about so far, but also balancing that against the readability of that overall arc gesture. For this reason, I've left more open spaces in this one rather than filling in the silhouette, because I want to be able to remember some of these placements and overlaps when I come back around to add color. So here's a little summary of where we're at so far. I've started from those rudimentary stick figures and then built up the form by thinking about the muscle shapes on different parts of the body, all the while trying to maintain a clear read on the important characteristics of the gesture and the silhouette. Now it's time to give these some proper depth and polish by adding some color. Last week we were looking at some pixel art from the Sega Game Gear, and I broke down the posing from some of these X-Men sprites. So now I kind of want to do the reverse idea and build up my Spider-Man sprites into the rendering style of this game. Just because I really like the look of these small character sprites with this kind of moderate color count. And I think it'd be fun to see Spidey along with this crew as well once we're all finished. To get me started, I've poached a series of colors directly from those Game Gear sprites. And the first thing I'm doing is laying in some solid red and blue to define the basic color blocking of Spider-Man's costume. And then adding other prominent features like his eyes, or I guess just the single eye that we can see in this case, and then also the emblem on his chest. From here, I'm using the darker red tone, this sort of brown color, to see where I can drop in some shaded pixels to serve both as shading, but also as a bit of anchoring, or kind of like a partial outlining to give some presence to the sprite. Dark pixels applied within the sprite are good for indicating areas of dramatic change, whether it's a defined edge in their clothing, or maybe a change in angle with respect to the light source. Conversely, dark pixels around the sprite are really good for giving them this defined edge against a background. And also, if we let some of the mid-tone pixels break up that outline, it can actually indicate more mass at that spot, such as this area here on his bicep. In order to give myself more control of the shading, I'm introducing a new red tone here, something that's 50% between that of the current mid and dark tones. And this can be used in spots where we want to ease the transition from light to dark, or to create a spot that has definition or topography to it without having to make as strong of a commitment as we would have had to with the full dark tone. One of the goals with this coloring approach was to preserve the angles and curves that we've been talking about this whole time, and in fact to elevate them really. I went about this by trying to maintain these somewhat continuous clusters of mid-tone color along those prominent areas. So that's why it's nice to start with that solid color blocking like I'd done, and then the shading or the line work pixels are just dotted in around that. So with his arm, for instance, there's that main flow of the mid-tone red pixels there, just like how they are in the purely silhouetted version. And then the shading is added only to indicate areas rounding away from the light source, while simultaneously providing visual anchor points for the sprite in general. Another good example for shading is in the way his thighs are splayed out here. So there's solid shading between them, and then slowly coming out of that into brighter colors, which I've then also accentuated by a single highlight pixel on the kneecap. With this swing sprite, one of the challenges was that there's a bit of overlap in body parts of the same color here. Some of the shoulder is hidden slightly behind the head, and then there's that arm coming down in the front also. So I'm using the shade tone to break those parts up. And it might even be one of those cases where it's sort of bending the rules a little bit as far as the light source, but it's for the sake of readability in such a small space like this anyway. So it's good to have some sort of separation between pieces like that. It's just like using it like an outline in this case. As you might be able to tell by how much my cursor is bouncing around here, a lot of this becomes somewhat just trial and error. It's this iterative kind of thing where you're basically figuring out different solutions to the readability and the shading. I mentioned the width of the front arm here being a concern during the previous phase. So the idea here was to use those 3 red tones in a way that gives a rounded appearance and has the sides of the bicep tapering away into shadow. For me, the pixels in the shade tones kind of contribute less of a visual presence to what I perceive the bulk of the muscle to be than the bright red does. So in a way, you're kind of able to have flexible options that aren't locked into discrete widths the way that a single color would be. Different shades within a color group are essentially a contouring tool, and their application will give your sprite different levels of presence and shaping. Similarly, we can use shaded tones to convey very basic levels of depth in a character sprite. You often see this in side-scroller sprites, where the far side of the sprite uses a full step darker in tone and generally lower contrast than that of the side closer into view. I've attempted something like that approach on this other swing sprite, since we've got these overlapping limbs going on here. So the idea was to keep the front arm and leg in the main mid-tone color, while the further arm and leg are primarily just in the shade tone. This way it's hopefully not as much of a struggle to resolve where everything is on the sprite, and that'll provide a clearer understanding of the pose itself. So here's a closing summary of all that work, and that crossover comparison with the Game Gear X-Men sprites that inspired the rendering here. I hope this helped clarify some of the thoughts in taking a stick figure through to a full-form sprite. There are, of course, other ways to go about designing and rendering sprites, whether it be by starting with shapes or blob silhouettes or anything like that. But what I like about this workflow is that it gives you a simple but solid foundation to build from. And it's helped me quite a bit to improve its sprite work over the years, so that's why I'm always kind of going on about this kind of thing. So anyway, thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.